The morning sun streamed through the cathedral windows, casting golden patterns across the marble floor. Margaret adjusted her navy dress for the 100th time, her hands trembling with excitement. Today, her only son David was getting married. She had raised him alone after his father died when David was just 7. 23 years of sacrifices, late-night shifts at the hospital, skipped meals so he could have better clothes, better opportunities. And now he stood at the altar, handsome in his tailored suit, waiting for his bride. "Mom, you look beautiful," David had told her that morning, kissing her forehead. Those words had meant everything. Victoria glided down the aisle like a vision in white. Margaret had always felt something off about her future daughter-in-law, something cold behind those perfectly practiced smiles. But David loved her, and that was supposed to be enough. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly. David's vows brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She had done it, raised a good man, a successful architect with a kind heart. As they exchanged rings, Margaret felt a rare moment of peace. But Victoria's mother, Catherine, kept glancing at Margaret with an expression that made her skin crawl. It wasn't dislike exactly, it was something worse, pity mixed with contempt. The reception hall gleamed with crystal chandeliers and white roses. Margaret sat at the family table, watching David and Victoria's first dance. Her feet ached in her new shoes, the only pair nice enough for the occasion, purchased on sale 3 months ago. "Champagne, ma'am?" A waiter appeared at her elbow. "No, thank you, just water." She couldn't afford to relax, not yet. Something felt wrong, like static electricity before a storm. Victoria's father, Richard, a wealthy real estate developer, had insisted on paying for everything. "No expense spared for our princess," he'd boasted. Margaret had been grateful then. Now, watching the opulent display, she felt small. During dinner, Margaret overheard a conversation between Victoria's bridesmaids. "Can you believe David's mother wore times that asterisk?" one whispered, not quietly enough. Victoria said she offered to buy her something appropriate, but she refused. Margaret's face burned. Victoria had never offered any such thing. She would have remembered, would have declined politely. Yes, but the offer had never come. David appeared beside her. "Mom, you okay? You look pale." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." He squeezed her shoulder and moved on to greet more guests. Margaret noticed Victoria watching them, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When it came time for speeches, Margaret stood nervously. She had practiced her toast for weeks, wanting to get it perfect. "I remember when David was 5, she began, her voice shaking slightly. "He told me he was going to marry a princess. I told him princesses don't exist, but he insisted he'd find one anyway. And Victoria, watching you two together, I think he was right all along." The guests applauded politely. Victoria's smile was frozen. Catherine whispered something to her husband, and they both laughed quietly. Margaret sat down, feeling like she'd said something wrong, though she couldn't imagine what. An hour later, David approached. His expression was strange, tight, controlled. "Mom, can you come with me for a minute? To the garden?" "Of course." She followed him outside, where the party sounds faded to a distant hum. Victoria was already there, her wedding dress luminous in the twilight. But her face was hard. "David, what's this about?" He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Victoria has something she needs to say to you." Victoria stepped forward, arms crossed. "Margaret, I'm going to be direct. David and I have been discussing our future, and there are some concerns we need to address." "Concerns?" Margaret's heart began to pound. About your behaviour, your attempts to control David, to make him feel guilty about moving on with his life. What? I've never... She's right, Mom. David's voice was cold, unfamiliar. You've been calling me 3 times a day, dropping by our apartment unannounced, making Victoria feel unwelcome. Margaret felt the world tilting. I called to check on wedding plans. I visited twice. When you invited me for dinner, you're suffocating him, Victoria said sharply. And it ends today. David, please. Margaret reached for her son's hand. I don't understand what's happening. He pulled away. You need to let me go, Mom. Stop trying to guilt me about your sacrifices. I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask you to work yourself to death. The words hit like physical blows. David, I never... Enough. His face was red now, twisted with an anger she'd never seen before. I'm tired of being your whole life. It's pathetic. Get your own life and leave mine alone. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Please, son, don't. The slap came from nowhere. David's palm connected with her cheek, the crack echoing in the garden like a gunshot. She stumbled backward, hand to her face, staring at her son in shock. Victoria stood behind him, a small, satisfied smile playing at her lips. If you ever contact him again, without permission, Victoria said quietly, we'll get a restraining order. Do you understand? Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She turned and ran through the reception hall where guests stared through the parking lot to her old Honda Civic. Her hands shook so badly she could barely get the key in the ignition. Behind her, the party continued. Laughter and music drifted through the night air as if nothing had happened. As if her world hadn't just shattered. She drove home in a daze, her cheek throbbing, her mind refusing to process what had just occurred. Her son, her David, had struck her, had told her he wished he'd never been born. At home, she collapsed on her couch and stared at the walls covered with David's photos. Every birthday, every graduation, every achievement, her whole life documented in frames. The next 3 days passed in a fog. Margaret called in sick to work, unable to face anyone. She replayed the scene endlessly, searching for what she'd done wrong. On the 4th day, her phone rang. An unknown number. Mrs. Reeves? This is Detective Sarah Chen. I need to speak with you about your son. Margaret's blood ran cold. Is he okay? He's fine. It's not about his safety. May I come by? An hour later, Detective Chen sat in Margaret's living room, declining tea, her expression professional but kind. Mrs. Reeves, I'm investigating a series of financial frauds. Your son's name has come up in connection with one of the victims. That's impossible. David is an architect and honest. I'm sure he is, but his wife's family is another matter. Detective Chen opened her briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. Richard Stratton, Victoria's father, is currently under investigation for running an elaborate real estate scheme. He's been defrauding elderly clients for years, promising dream properties and taking their life savings. Margaret's head swam. What does this have to do with David? We believe Victoria targeted your son specifically. Mr. Stratton needs to appear legitimate, to have connections with respectable professionals. An architect's son-in-law with no criminal record helps that image. But David would never. We don't think David knows anything. But Victoria? She has a pattern. This is her 3rd marriage. The first 2 ended badly. when her previous husbands discovered the truth about her family. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened to them? One is still fighting legal battles. The other... Chen paused. He died in a suspicious accident. The investigation was inconclusive. After Detective Chen left, Margaret sat in silence for hours. Everything made sense now. Victoria's calculated cruelty, the way she'd isolated David, the slap orchestrated to drive them apart permanently. They wanted David compliant, alone, without anyone to warn him or pull him back when the legal troubles started. And Margaret, the devoted mother who knew her son best, had to be removed. But they'd made a mistake. They'd assumed Margaret would crumble, would accept her banishment quietly. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Margaret opened her laptop and began to research. Richard Stratton, Catherine Stratton, Victoria Stratton, court records, news articles, property transactions. She worked through the night, making notes, drawing connections. By dawn, she had a plan. Margaret's first call was to James Torres, her late husband's best friend and a retired private investigator. Maggie? God, I haven't heard from you in years. How's David? James, I need your help. And I need you to not ask questions until I explain everything. 2 hours later, James sat at her kitchen table, reading through her research, his weathered face growing darker. You're sure about all this? Detective Chen confirmed most of it. The rest, I need you to verify. James leaned back, whistling low. This is serious, Maggie. If they're dangerous enough to have killed someone, then my son is in danger, and I'm the only one who can save him. Even though he... James gestured to the fading bruise on her cheek. Asterisk. Especially times because of that. David isn't himself. They've poisoned his mind somehow. James nodded slowly. Okay, I'm in. But we do this smart. No cowboy stuff. James's investigation moved quickly. Within a week, he'd uncovered damning evidence. Shell companies, forged documents, testimony from victims who'd lost everything to Richard Stratton's schemes. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maggie, you need to see this. James's voice on the phone was urgent. He arrived with a manila envelope. Inside were photographs Victoria with another man taken just 3 weeks before the wedding. The photos were intimate, unmistakable. His name is Marcus Kane. He works for Richard Stratton. And get this, they're not just having an affair, they're married, have been for 5 years. Margaret's hands went numb. Then David is married to a woman who's already married, which means their marriage is invalid. But more importantly, James pulled out more documents. Look at this life insurance policy. Margaret's blood turned to ice. David had a $2 million policy, recently updated. Beneficiary, Victoria Stratton. We need to go to the police, Margaret said. But James shook his head. With what? Circumstantial evidence and a bigamy charge? Rich people with good lawyers can drag this out for years. Meanwhile, David's in danger every single day. Then what do we do? James smiled grimly. We make them come to us. We use their greed against them. The plan was risky. Margaret would reach out to Victoria, not with accusations, but with surrender. She would offer to sign over her modest house, the only asset she had, as a peace offering, claiming she wanted back in David's life. It'll never work, Margaret protested. My house isn't worth enough to interest them. You'd be surprised. But it's not about the house. It's about getting you in a room with them, wearing a wire, getting them to talk about their plans. And if they suspect, then we go to plan B. What's plan B? James didn't answer. Margaret's email to Victoria was carefully crafted, humble and desperate. Asterisk, dear Victoria. Asterisk, asterisk. I've had time to reflect on my behaviour and realise you were right. I was too clingy, too needy. I just want to make amends. I'm willing to sign my house over to you and David as a wedding gift. It's all I have. But I want you to know I support your marriage. Asterisk, asterisk. Could we meet to discuss this? I promise not to cause any scenes. Asterisk, asterisk. Margaret asterisk. The response came within an hour. Asterisk, Margaret. Asterisk, asterisk. How thoughtful. Let's meet Tuesday at 3 p.m. My father's office downtown. Come alone. Asterisk. Asterisk v asterisk. James set Margaret up with a wire, showing her how to activate it, how to guide the conversation. Remember, you need them to talk about David, about their plans, about the money, and if it goes wrong, I'll be in a van outside. Any sign of trouble, I'm coming in. Richard Stratton's office was all mahogany and leather, designed to intimidate. Victoria sat behind the massive desk like she owned it, which, Margaret realised, she probably would someday. Catherine was there too, and Marcus Kane, introduced as Richard's associate. No, David. Margaret's heart sank. So, Victoria said, sliding papers across the desk. The house. Sign here. I'd like to discuss this first. I want to understand. There's nothing to discuss. Victoria's voice was sharp. You sign, or you never speak to David again. Where is David? Working. He doesn't know about this meeting, and he won't unless you cooperate. Margaret felt her pulse racing. She had to keep them talking. Does he know you're still married to Marcus? The room went silent. Marcus stood up, his casual demeanour vanishing. Richard's face darkened. Catherine's hand moved toward her purse. Victoria's smile was cold as death. What did you say? I know everything, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. The fraud, the bigamy, the life insurance policy. And I'm not the only one. Victoria laughed a harsh, brittle sound. And who's going to believe you? The bitter, obsessive mother who crashed her son's wedding, who he had to physically remove? That slap was staged, Margaret said, the pieces finally clicking together. You coached him, told him I'd said something, done something. I told him you tried to seduce Richard, Victoria said casually. That you came to our house drunk, made advances, and when he rejected you, you threatened to ruin the wedding. I had Catherine back up the story. Catherine nodded, smirking. David didn't want to believe it, Victoria continued. So sweet, so trusting. But when I showed him proof, some well-timed texts from a burner phone, some photos we staged, he believed. And when you confronted him at the wedding, acting crazy, it confirmed everything. Why? Margaret whispered. Why do all this? Richard spoke for the first time, his voice oily. Because we can. Because people like David, honest, hard-working, naive, make perfect patsies. When my business collapses, as it inevitably will, David will take the fall. His signatures are on half the documents, and when that becomes too complicated, he didn't finish, but Margaret understood. The life insurance, the accident. You're insane, she breathed. We're practical, Victoria corrected. And you're a problem we're about to solve. Marcus moved toward Margaret, but she stood her ground. I'm wearing a wire. Everything you've said has been recorded. And if I don't walk out of here in 5 minutes, a detective gets the recording, along with all the evidence we've compiled." Victoria's composure cracked. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Margaret pulled her phone from her purse, showing a live call connection. "Hi, James." "Heard everything, Maggie?" James's voice came through, clear and strong. "Cops are already on their way." Richard lunged for the door, but it burst open before he reached it. Detective Chen entered, followed by 4 uniformed officers. "Richard Stratton, Victoria Kane, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy and attempted murder in the death of Victoria's second husband." The room erupted into chaos. Victoria screamed, attacking Chen, who subdued her efficiently. Marcus tried to run and was tackled. Catherine fainted dramatically. Through it all, Margaret stood frozen, watching the people who tried to destroy her son being hauled away in handcuffs. "You did good," James said, appearing at her side. "Damn good." But Margaret felt hollow. "I need to see David." David's apartment was dark when Margaret arrived. She knocked, her heart pounding, unsure if he'd even open the door. He did, and his face was haggard, eyes red. "I heard," he said quietly. "The police came to my office. Told me everything." He swallowed hard. "Victoria's not who I thought. The marriage isn't even legal, and the things she said about you. David, I hit you." His voice broke. "I hit my mother because I believed. God, Mom, what did I do?" He collapsed, sobbing, and Margaret caught him, holding her son like she had when he was small. "It's okay," she whispered, though it wasn't, not yet. "We'll get through this." The next weeks were difficult. David moved back home temporarily, unable to face his apartment full of memories of Victoria. He attended therapy, dealing with the guilt and shame of how he'd been manipulated. "She was so careful," he told Margaret one evening. "So gradual, little comments about how you called too much, how you disapproved of her, fake texts and emails supposedly from you, saying terrible things about her. By the wedding, I actually believed you'd tried to seduce Richard." "She was a professional," Margaret said gently. "This is what she did." "I should have known. Should have trusted you. You're not the only victim here, sweetheart." The trial approached. Richard, Catherine, and Marcus all took plea deals, but Victoria insisted on fighting. Her lawyer painted her as another victim, manipulated by her father. Margaret attended every day of Victoria's trial. She watched as prosecutor after prosecutor laid out the evidence. The bigamy, the life insurance schemes, the affairs, the deliberate isolation of David. But the most damning testimony came from Victoria's first husband, Thomas Reynolds. "She told me her family was wealthy but conservative," he said from the stand. "That they'd disown her if she married without their approval. So we kept it secret. Then strange things started happening. My brakes failed. I fell downstairs. When I finally left her, she cleaned out our joint account and disappeared." Victoria's face remained impassive throughout, but Margaret saw the calculation in her eyes, the cold assessment of whether she could still win. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Victoria's sentencing hearing was packed. Victim after victim stood to give impact statements, people who'd lost their savings to Richard's schemes, other men Victoria had targeted. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood slowly, facing the woman who'd nearly destroyed her family. "I don't hate you," Margaret said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I pity you. You could have had a real family, real love. My son would have given you everything. But you chose cruelty instead. You chose to destroy rather than build, and now you'll have years to consider whether it was worth it." Victoria's mask finally cracked. "You self-righteous bitch," she hissed. "You think you've won? Your son will never be the same. I broke him, and you know it." The judge's gavel slammed down. "Miss Kane, that's enough. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in state prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. As Victoria was led away, screaming, Margaret felt something release in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite vindication, just the tiniest seed of peace. 6 months later, Margaret stood in David's new apartment, helping him unpack boxes. He'd sold the old place, unable to bear the memories, and started fresh. "This one," he said, holding up a framed photo of them from his college graduation, "goes on the mantel." They'd been working on their relationship, rebuilding trust through family therapy and honest conversations. David had apologized so many times Margaret finally had to tell him to stop. "We move forward," she'd said. "Not back." He was dating again, cautiously, with Margaret's blessing. "I promised to introduce you early this time," he'd said, smiling. "And I promise not to drop by unannounced," she'd replied. They were finding a new balance, mother and son, but also two adults with separate lives that intersected with love and respect. 1 year after the wedding that wasn't, Margaret sat in her garden, watching the sunset. David arrived for their weekly dinner, bringing flowers and wine. "From the farmer's market," he said. "The vendor asked about you, Mrs. Chen from the Vietnamese stand, said she missed seeing you. I'll have to visit this week." They cooked together, talking about David's new project at work, Margaret's volunteer work at the hospital, normal things, healing things. As they ate, David reached across the table, taking his mother's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me, for fighting when I couldn't." Margaret squeezed his hand. "That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We fight for our children, even when they can't see. They need fighting for. I love you, Mom. I love you too." Outside, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and for the first time, in a long time, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Not just for survival, but for genuine happiness. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. David still had nightmares. Margaret still flinched at loud voices. The scars of betrayal didn't heal overnight, but they were healing together. And that was enough. That was everything.